The Twilight Zone. It's a term that many are familiar with when describing something out of the ordinary. For example, the phrase, "we're living in the Twilight Zone," has become a common expression today. But I find it a little crazy that so many people can use a phrase like that without knowing its origin. The Twilight Zone is a classic American TV anthology series created by what I would consider one of the greatest TV writers in history, Rod Serling. Airing from 1959 to 1964, The Twilight Zone became renowned for its thought-provoking stories that blended science fiction, fantasy, horror, surrealism, and mystery elements, which often incorporated clever twist endings far ahead of their time. The show explored complex themes such as human nature, morality, fear, and the unknown in ways that no other show before it could. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything here. The Twilight Zone is without a doubt my favorite TV show of all time. I still remember being a kid and channel surfing trying to find something to watch on some not so random summer day. Remember channel surfing? Good times. Anyway, I called it a not so random day because I first came across the Twilight Zone on the Sci-fi channel during their annual 4th of July marathon. I don't know what I saw on the TV that day when I was channel surfing that made me stop and watch, but whatever it was, kid me was instantly hooked. I had seen commercials for the Twilight Zone before, so I knew it had elements of horror, and growing up I loved anything scary. But I quickly found out that the Twilight Zone was so much more than just horror. I fell down the Twilight Zone rabbit hole that day as my eyes were glued to the TV during the all-day marathon, and I was never the same again. Okay, maybe a bit dramatic, but my kid mind was seriously blown by the stories I was watching unfold. And I'm glad I kept the TV on that channel that day because it forever influenced the type of content I love. The Twilight Zone is so highly regarded by so many entertainment enthusiasts because it changed the game. And as I've gotten older, I've started to take notice of the show's influence on movies, TV shows, games, theme park rides, you name it. My goal here today is to inform you, the viewer, about the Twilight Zone's influence on many popular shows such as Black Mirror and many of today's most prominent storytellers such as Jordan Peele. My goal here today is to celebrate the most influential TV show of all time.
The Twilight Zone.
To truly appreciate the genius of the Twilight Zone, we must first understand the context in which it was created. An on-the-rise TV writer by the name of Rod Serling had an idea. He wanted to tell stories that delved deep into thought-provoking and oftentimes controversial themes that American TV audiences considered taboo at the time. Topics such as prejudice, racism, war, and existentialism, just to name a few. These were the stories that Rod Serling wanted to tell the world, but he found it hard to get any network to listen. Serling, being the brilliant mind that he was, found a workaround that would prevent any further rejection or censorship from TV networks. His idea was to present these stories featuring moral dilemmas under the guise of being sci-fi, horror, fantasy, or thriller tales. You'd think that the suits at TV stations would catch this, but I guess I'm giving them too much credit. Let's face it, the execs at CBS were dumber than a bag of hammers for not being able to recognize these stories as deep and meaningful rather than just science fiction. But hey, it worked in our favor because they officially greenlit The Twilight Zone, which changed television forever. From the moment the show starts, you're greeted by a voiceover from Rod Serling alongside the now iconic opening theme. Seriously, dude, Rod Serling has one of the coolest voices of all time. This guy can read cereal ingredients to me and I'd be enthralled. Also, I'm pretty sure this is an unpopular opinion, but I prefer the season 1 opening theme and narration compared to the now iconic one that began in season 2. Not that I don't like the most recognizable theme in Twilight Zone history, it's peak actually. I just think the somber, slower nature of the season 1 opening set the tone a little bit better. Regardless, every iteration of the series intro drew you in, guided by Rod Serling's monologue as he prepared you to step into another dimension. A dimension that disregards everything you've ever known, or thought you knew. As Rod Serling said it himself in the intro, when you cross over into the Twilight Zone, you're crossing over into the dimension of imagination. It's almost a warning to brace yourself for what you're about to watch. And you see, this warning, although disguised simply as the show's intro, was very much needed back in the late 50s, early 60s. Can you imagine? The majority of shows on TV during that era were your run-of-the-mill sitcoms, dramas, and westerns. Then in walks this show where a fucking monster is on the wing of an airplane, which in turn will give you flying anxiety for the rest of your life. Rod Serling, you're such a beast, dude. The anthology format also gave the storytelling much more freedom. Every single episode is its own self-contained story with a unique cast, setting, and plot. To this day, this still blows my mind considering they put out 156 episodes over 5 seasons. That's an average of 31 episodes per season. Nothing against Black Mirror, which is one of the shows I mentioned earlier as being directly inspired by the Twilight Zone, but they tend to put out only like 5 episodes a season in comparison. I get it, different times and all that, but it just shows you that everyone involved with the Twilight Zone was firing on all cylinders to deliver a quality viewing experience. And out of 156 episodes, I can hardly say there's a single bad one. Sure, there's a few in there that are slower than the heavyweight fan favorites, but what I can say for certain is that every single episode was written with care. Rod Serling wrote 92 out of the 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone. An insane catalog of quality, and how could it not be? This show was his baby. But for the very few that Mr. Serling didn't write, he enlisted the help of some of the very best sci-fi horror and fantasy writers of that time, such as Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont. This was literally the Avengers of sci-fi writers, and it shows in the quality of the show. This is one thing that many in the modern television landscape fail to realize. The best writers of a genre will excel in that genre. It sounds like common sense, right? Well, I mentioned this specifically because for the 2019 Twilight Zone reboot, the higher-ups on that show decided it was a good idea to hire anything but sci-fi, horror, and/or fantasy writers. But anyway, that's a story for another time. This show was so carefully crafted from top to bottom that it's no wonder why it provided some of the most memorable stories ever put to production. This is the fun part. The part where we talk about the episodes themselves. I really don't know how to start this part of the video, so I guess I'll just list some of my favorite episodes alongside their plots. Don't worry, no spoilers. The Midnight Sun, where the Earth is knocked off its orbit and starts gradually moving towards the sun. 5 characters in search of an exit, with a self-explanatory title yet incredibly compelling story. The Long Morrow, which tells the story of an astronaut who falls in love just before embarking on a 40-year space expedition. To Serve Man sees aliens come to Earth with the promise of helping mankind. Eye of the Beholder follows a woman undergoing a final medical procedure to conform to societal standards of beauty. Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up, a classic whodunit story that takes place at a diner. Stopover in a Quiet Town features a couple waking up in an unfamiliar town with no recollection of how they got there. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which shows a small neighborhood community start to turn against each other in classic mob mentality fashion. There's simply far too many to list here, but I wanted to give you guys a few of my favorites. And sure, the premises are intriguing on their own, but it's the writing and filmmaking that must deliver to ensure those ideas reach their full potential. And for it being late 50s, early 60s television, the production crew did the most with their budget every single time. Camera tricks, visual effects, aided by experienced filmmakers and top-tier acting talent was lightning in a bottle. And the dialogue, my goodness, the dialogue. Everyone says the Twilight Zone is timeless because of its ability to tap into universal fears and the human condition. And that's 100% accurate. But I don't think it would have aged as gracefully if it weren't for its incredible dialogue. Characters on the Twilight Zone are introspective yet efficient. Because of the 25-minute runtime of each episode, the dialogue had to be efficient and impactful. Each line served a purpose, whether it was advancing the plot, developing characters, or underscoring the episode's theme. Rod Serling had a gift for saying a lot with a little. He arguably had the deepest understanding of human nature in Hollywood during his era. Serling simply knew how to pace a story brilliantly with a satisfying payoff. One of the most iconic aspects of The Twilight Zone is its twist endings. Just when you thought you had the story figured out, Rod Serling and company would completely flip the story on its head. The beauty of The Twilight Zone's twist endings, however, is that they weren't simply crafted for shock value. These twists served as a means of delivering the show's deeper messages about human nature, society, and the unknown. The use of irony and metaphor in the storytelling created a sense of unpredictability that kept viewers engaged and encouraged them to think critically about the themes presented. I'm about to talk about the ending of a popular episode, so if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to this time on the screen. Ready? Okay. In the episode, the monsters are due on Maple Street. A suburban neighborhood descends into paranoia and chaos when a mysterious power outage leads residents to suspect that some among them are aliens. As fear and suspicion grow, the neighbors turn on each other, resulting in violence and hysteria. The twist reveals that the true culprits are aliens observing from afar, who manipulate the humans into destroying themselves, demonstrating that humanity's own fear and distrust are its greatest enemies. By revealing that the real monsters are not the aliens, but the townspeople themselves, the episode offers a chilling commentary on the dangers of mob mentality, prejudice, and the fragility of social order, themes that remain relevant today. This is the Twilight Zone. These are the themes that Rod Serling set out to tackle under the guise of science fiction. And that's only one episode out of 156 which offers some form of social commentary. It's brilliant because it's subtle. It had to be. It's not like a lot of the things you see today that lack any or all subtlety. It seems like the more time passes, the more we need to be beaten over the head with a message instead of planting a seed that'll eventually grow bigger the more you sit with it. Once again, the 2019 Twilight Zone reboot was a huge offender of this. Rod Serling, on the other hand, trusted his audience enough to understand the message he was trying to convey. The Twilight Zone was unique in that it explored ambiguous situations, but almost always conveyed a strong moral perspective. Rod Serling introduced and signed off almost every single episode with narrations summing up the message of the episode. And even then, he was still wise with his words as to not come across too strong with his messaging. Some of the episodes don't even really have resolutions, and yet you never feel cheated because the writing was simply that good. Rod Serling never felt the need to over-explain a story. He felt it was more impactful if we sometimes didn't see what came next. And I have to say, he was correct. The Twilight Zone's footprint in today's landscape is prominent, and sometimes one wouldn't even know it. Jordan Peele films are now seen as major event films, and you know where he got his inspiration from? Twilight Zone. Matter of fact, his film Us was directly inspired by Twilight Zone episode Mirror Image. Stephen King is another prominent horror writer who gives credit to the Twilight Zone as inspiration for some of his works. M. Night Shyamalan, who's now considered very hit or miss with his films, but that's okay because he made Signs, is also a Twilight Zone style storyteller, with twist endings even becoming a trademark of his films. The entire Final Destination series was inspired by a single Twilight Zone episode by the name of 22. And as I've mentioned a couple times already, popular acclaimed Netflix show Black Mirror is considered by many a spiritual successor to Rod Serling's series. Lost, with all its twists and mysteries, drew its roots from the Twilight Zone. Even Christopher Nolan cites the Twilight Zone as an inspiration for some of his works, such as Interstellar and Inception. In other words, if it's in the horror, sci-fi, psychological thriller genre, then chances are that it was influenced by the Twilight Zone in some way or another. But why? Because at the end of the day, no matter if there were aliens, monsters, or angels, the stories were character-driven. They were human-driven. The Twilight Zone stood out from other shows of its time due to its innovative format, bold exploration of social issues, world-class writing, and ambitious film-level production. By wrapping these themes in compelling narratives with unexpected twists, the show provided not just entertainment, but also a platform for profound reflection on what it means to be human. And not just critical self-reflection, but reflection of the world around us as well. It's sad to say, but the main reason the Twilight Zone will forever remain timeless is because humans will never change their ways. The topics at hand on this show from the 60s shouldn't still be relevant all these decades later, but unfortunately, they are. Rod Serling was ahead of his time. He knew how vicious, how careless we as humans could be, and he wrote a lot of stories about it. But on the other hand, he also had hope. Not all Twilight Zone episodes are bleak. Every now and then, Rod Serling showed the glimmer of hope he had in humanity with an episode that wanted you to look forward, wanted you to live. Walking Distance is perhaps the best example of that. In this episode, The moral revolves around the idea that nostalgia and longing for the past can prevent us from fully embracing the present. Walking Distance suggests that while it's natural to cherish fond memories, we must accept and live in the current moment to find true fulfillment and happiness. And that's just one example. There's an episode for every human emotion on this show, for every human dilemma. A show for all. Because at the end of the day, that's all Rod Serling wanted to do. To connect us, to reach us through art. The Twilight Zone continues to influence today's world by shaping the way we approach storytelling, social commentary, and the blending of genre with profound moral questions. It's a legacy that spans modern television, film, and literature, reminding us that thought-provoking narratives can challenge our perceptions, provoke deep reflection, and resonate across generations.